Hello, everybody. You are listening to Through Time and Clades. My name is Albert.
And I'm Joan.
Woo! So we are back pretty soon, at least as far as our typical schedule goes. So yes, because last time we did a news episode covering stories from January of this year, but of course we are still overdue for an episode covering February stories, and so that's what we're going to try to do here. Uh, how have you been doing? I know it's not been that long since we last recorded, but what are things like?
Not a whole lot's been going on. The biggest thing that's been kind of frustrating is on the 12th here in the States, we had our daylight savings time.
Yeah.
So we sprung forward at 2 in the morning. And so we lost an hour this time around. And it's been a couple of days, and I still have not recovered
Mm.
from it. Because it's like I'm waking up later, like an hour later than I want to, and I'm like, okay, well, I'll go to bed early this time. And then my body's just so tired, I want to get out of bed, even though, and it's all kind of jumbled.
Hmm.
So I'm doing the best that I can. Um, but otherwise, things are going smoothly. The weather is still very erratic, where one day it'll be very cold with high winds, and then the other day it'll be really hot with no wind,
Mm.
and it's that is how it be, it seems. Um, but how about you? How have things been with you?
Oh, so on my end of things, I've been pretty busy, I have to say. So I'm mainly trying to finish off several research projects that I have going and have been going for a long time, and trying to kind of wrap things up. And that's pretty much been most of what I've been working on this year so far. And yeah, I'm finally at the stage where the finish line is in sight on a couple of those projects. But yeah, it's just been quite an ordeal trying to get everything together. Nonetheless, I did find time to work on this episode, and I'm definitely excited to get into the stories we have this time.
Yeah, me as well. A couple of interesting things we could talk about today. Trying in ways to kind of expand the coverage of certain topics on our show, which
Mm.
is always a noble goal, I feel. But before we do that, we do have a couple shout outs and follow ups to get through. So how about we go ahead and jump into those?
Sure.
All right. So first things first, we wanted to highlight two new books that came out recently that our friends have worked on.
Hmm.
And so the first one here to the left, this is Ancient Sea Reptiles. This is by Darren Naish, the paleontologist and blogger behind the world famous Tetrapod Zoology blog and podcast and convention. So they've had quite a bit of traction in recent years. Um, this is considered a companion, if you will, to an earlier book that he worked on with paleontologist Paul Barrett, Dinosaurs, How They Lived and Evolved, which I believe has gone through two editions already. So they're trying to keep up with all the fast updates in the world of paleo by making new editions every couple of years, which is always a noble goal, even if it happens so fast. Um, in fact, this one itself, I think, has already gotten out of date in a couple of respects. Like within days of like a release. But which again, like that's book writing 101. The text for a lot of these works that are the most up to date in the field are often written like months and months ahead. So there's always going to be a chance for things to slip in.
Yep.
Um, but either way, Ancient Sea Reptiles covers much the same goal as Dinosaurs, How They Lived and Evolved. In this case, to highlight the current diversity and research of Mesozoic marine reptiles. And so, in a very broad sense. So, not just the long necked plesiosaurs and the short necked plesiosaurs or the ichthyosaurs and mosasaurs. We have many other obscure groups of both extinct and extant lineages. So, like if you want to learn about early sea snakes or crocodile relatives. They are covered here as well. Now, such a book of this sort, which brings up, you know, many up-to-date materials, even despite the progress of the field, how rapid it is, this was very sorely needed for the general public and for specialists alike. Many of the previous books available on marine reptiles um, are now either too old
Hmm.
or too expensive,
Right.
or they aren't complete enough as this to kind of serve the function as a full introductory guide. Um, and we've learned so much about these animals too. Darren Naish himself has actually argued that marine reptiles had their own kind of renaissance of study, comparable to the dinosaurs. In this case, though, it would have started in the 1990s, as especially as more countries have kind of joined the U.S. and the UK in supplying fossils of uh, marine reptiles to study and add to our growing knowledge. Um, so what's really great about this book is that it is fully illustrated in color with contributions by the current school of paleo artists. So a lot of big names, old and new, show up here between the pages. And of course, that means that the quality of the life restorations are top notch. They're the best that they can be, which is always admirable for something like this. Especially since a lot of non-specialists will be reading this too, and so they can actually see how these animals looked in life, not just in movies, for example.
Mm.
Um, and of course, there are many graphics and charts from recent research papers, as well as great photos of the fossils. So this is sure to be a very popular and extraordinary book. And already, as I understand it, that's kind of already been happening as of late, as the book has reached more and more people. Um, Folks who buy it say that it's everything that they wanted. So that's kind of great. Now, uh, just to clarify, the two photos of the book here, these are the UK to the left and the US releases to the right.
Hmm.
Um, so the UK one is published under the Natural History Museum, and the US one is under the Smithsonian. And they're also quite affordable under those institutions and wherever books are sold. So it definitely seems like it would be a great addition to anyone's library who's interested or at least curious about ancient sea reptiles. Albert, do you have anything to add about this book? I haven't bought it myself yet, but I'm definitely it's on my list.
Hmm. Yeah, I ordered a copy, but I don't think it's mine is here yet. Um, However, it does look fantastic from everything I've seen and expect. The kind of predecessor to this one, if you will, the dinosaurs book that Darren and Paul Barrett did together, like that one is fantastic. So I mean, if that's any guide, I think this one will be too. In fact, the dinosaurs book, Dinosaurs: How They Lived and Evolved, is still one of my go-to recommendations when people ask me, "Oh, do you know any good resources for getting into dinosaur paleontology?" Or, I'm interested in that topic. Where can I learn more? That book is one of my go-to recommendations in response to that. Um, so I think this book is definitely in a very good position to do so when it comes to marine reptile paleontology. And I'm definitely excited to get a copy.
Yeah, for sure. And hey, speaking of dinosaurs, we got perhaps another book to add to that
Mm.
recommendation list as well. So this is Dinosaur World, and this is written by Evan Johnson Ransom, who is currently, I believe, a PhD student in dinosaur paleontology, um, and is fully illustrated by Julius Chetney, another one of the current school of paleo artists, who is very prolific. Those of you Jurassic World fans have probably seen some of his work on certain types of media, for example, as well as like other more paleo oriented um, works. Now, this is a book for more younger audiences, but no doubt anybody with an interest in dinosaurs will find it appealing. And I mean, just from what I've seen and heard about it, it certainly it certainly is. I
Mm.
mean, it boasts a nearly complete, and certainly for the time of release, of course,
Yeah.
roster of Mesozoic dinosaur diversity. I mean, as you can see from the cover here, there are over 1,200 profiles of different dinosaur genera. So each of these profiles is illustrated. So essentially, you're getting a currently, complete catalog of all the known dinosaurs,
Hmm.
which, and like each one illustrated visually, which is impressive. Even more impressive is the fact that towards the back of this book, they've included this huge section on all of the scrappy fossils as well. The ones where there's just not enough material to elaborate on life appearance
Hmm.
beyond maybe what clade the dinosaur belonged to. Um, and of course, that means that all of those profiles are accompanied by maybe like a rough silhouette. But still, it's impressive that Julius Chetney was able to find the time to illustrate all of like over 1,200 dinosaurs. Like, you gotta do the math, carry the one. Like, you know how many how many years that would take,
Yeah.
especially given Chetney's art style, where these animals are just vibrant and alive and beautifully detailed. It's impressive, and so that must and that then translates into the book being enormous, which is always fun. Like, look, if you're gonna write a dinosaur book, if it's a brick, that's pretty fun. That's a pretty good deal in my book.
Hmm.
Um, and of course, there are also other profiles as well, highlighting different paleontologists as well as the museums that they study with, and that you could also go to if you want to learn more. Um, and given the scale and ambition of this work, it is sure to take the place of the major dinosaur book of a generation.
Hmm.
Alongside, say, Dr. Thomas Holtz's Dinosaur Encyclopedia, classic Green Book, or even, and I've been seeing Dougal Dixon, his contributions to Southwater Publishing's complete illustrated encyclopedias, which folks have probably seen if you've been to bookstores. They're
Hmm.
usually highly affordable, and also like very dense with information. And his dinosaur book that he wrote, which because I have both copies of those as well. The Holtz's Dinopedia and um, the illustrated guide, and they're very impressive as well. But certainly at this point, Dinosaur World is going to be a favorite of kids and adults
Hmm.
for quite a long time, and I'm very happy for Evan Johnson Ransom for being able to work on and publish a book like this. It
Yeah.
looks incredible. Do you have any thoughts as well, Al?
Oh, mostly I would be repeating what you've already said, but like I haven't seen an actual copy of this book either, but just from the premise and from photographs that I have looked at, this is impressive. I think it's hard to overemphasize how impressive this is, not just in terms of the scope. I mean, for anyone to write a book like this covering nearly all of the species of Mesozoic dinosaurs and illustrating them, for that matter, on the part of the artist, uh, would be quite an undertaking, to say the least. Um, but not only that, but I mean, Evan is a PhD student, so like having to do your PhD on top of like writing a book like this, um, it's just mind-boggling that anyone can handle that. So hats off to you, Evan, and really impressive performance on the part of Julius Chetney too. So yeah, I agree with you. I think this is very much poised to be one of those kind of very influential books for people who are interested in dinosaurs.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very exciting. New books are always being written, and especially if they're by behind folks who are well attuned with the research, who are at the front, providing new discoveries and bringing obscure information to the general public. That's always a plus
Mm.
in our book for sure. And, if there are any others, of course, down the line, we'll certainly let you all know about those as well. So definitely, if you want to support these books, go check them out. We will post relevant links for purchase in the description. Um, but now let's move on to our follow-ups on the next slide. And gosh, the time flies sometimes because first of all, um, regarding forgotten bloodlines, the first independently produced paleo documentary, to
Hmm.
our knowledge, by Max Bellomio, has been fully funded. Woo! That was a couple days ago from the time of recording.
Hmm.
Their Kickstarter has reached their goal for the full funding of the first episode. And so at the time of writing and kind of looking back on the Kickstarter, uh, over $78,000 have been raised.
Wow.
Um, I'm sure that's a little bit higher now, but that's just over the 75,000 that they needed for that
Right.
first episode. And so today they put out a an announcement that production has officially begun, and so we will almost certainly see more from Forgotten Bloodlines in the near future. Um, Now, of course, there are still a couple days to go, um, because they have the stretch goal of $200,000 to do the first two episodes of the series. Um, but even so, if they don't reach that just yet, this is still a very great start, and we're very fortunate that it got to this point.
Hmm.
Um, Certainly, it's our hope that the popularity of the first episode uh, will inspire, the next Kickstarter projects to gain their funding too, and
Yeah.
then we'll be able to see the full Forgotten Bloodlines fully realized. So that's pretty exciting to hear.
Hmm.
Any comments on that, Alec?
Not much except to say, just to echo your thoughts, that is fantastic news, and I'm very, very happy to see that the goal has been achieved.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we'll post the link to the Kickstarter as well, for those who who want to maybe contribute a little bit more or just kind of follow the progress from there. So of course, we have some screenshots here from the production. They have the Intellidonts above and the early camel below, um, so you can kind of get an idea about what the visual style will be like.
Hmm.
Kind of hyper realistic. Kind of in the vein of the recent paleo documentary.
Yeah.
So it looked fantastic. And again, as we stressed before, all the animals have been given um, quality treatment, rigorous restorations, following the fossils as close as possible. So this is about as good as it gets for now,
Hmm.
barring having time travel invented somehow.
Right.
um, so that's pretty exciting. I also saw it, which was kind of cool. One of the ways that they helped acquire funding was they had, if I'm explaining this wrong, please correct me, but they had like a list of taxa, animals that were known from the agate fossil formation that the
Mm.
series is based on. And like if you donated a certain amount of money, you could like sponsor an animal
I think
to
so.
be
Yeah.
put into the documentary.
Right.
Um, I don't know how many have done that, by the time that the stretch goal was released, but I mean, just looking at the list, they had everything from mammals to like amphibians that hung out in the waterways. So I'm very curious to see like, who's gonna cameo in the
Yeah.
future.
Right. Right.
So that's kind of fun. But congratulations to the crew behind Forgotten Bloodlines, Max Bolomio. I'm very happy for you and everyone involved. It's very exciting to see. Now, our second and final follow up before we move on to our actual stories. Um, this was kind of a surprise paper
Mm.
that we caught wind of earlier this month. Um, so technically, it's a March story, but we felt that we had to include it on here. Um, this could have easily been like a whole news story that we saved for next month. But considering that this update reflects one of our quick stories that we covered back in our 2021 Roundup episode, we feel we'll treat it as such. So, back during that episode, we covered a new fossil from the early Cambrian of Australia and southern China called Proto-Melicion gatehousei, which Ziliang Zhang and colleagues argued was a possible stem bryozoan, a group of invertebrate animals that kind of encrust themselves onto surfaces and have
Hmm.
little tiny individual colonies that filter through the water, which would have effectively closed a 35 million year gap in the fossil record, thus connecting one of the last animal phyla, quote unquote, to the others that we know existed during the Cambrian, which was a big mystery for a while now.
Hmm.
But there was always a potential for future analyses to disprove that hypothesis, as had happened for other argued stem bryozoans in the past. And I
Mm-hmm.
believe we even covered some of those as well back in that episode. Well, here we are with Ji Yang et al.'s paper from March 8th, which argues that Protomelacion isn't a bryozoan after all. It probably isn't even an animal. So, by examining the tiny fossils along with some newly discovered ones, the team noted that there were aspects of the anatomy, like the rather thin walls and irregular folding of the individual modules that make up the surface of a colony, and you can kind of see some of these here on the graphic to the right. Um, they did not actually resemble bryozoans all that much. And in comparison with other aquatic fossils of this type, they argue that Protomolicion is instead a type of green algae belonging to a clade Dasyclades. Now, these are all unicellular forms with really big cells, and they form colonies too within tropical marine environments. And the way that they mineralize onto surfaces makes them very susceptible to fossilization. Ergo, we actually have many fossils of these types that have been found going back to the Ordovician at least. So by looking at those and living forms, as well as these Protomelacion fossils, the team were able to kind of make that link. And so they proposed this new classification scheme. Now, if that is the case, then Protomelacion would still represent one of the earliest known fossils of the dasyclad algae,
Mm.
alongside a number of other controversial forms that have been argued to belong as well. So even if it isn't a stem bryozoan after all, it would still be an important find nonetheless. So that's kind of exciting to see.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Al?
Yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, this is one of the things in paleontology, especially when it comes to interpreting, difficult to interpret fossils, is that there's always a chance of things like this happening, and new analysis just providing a new interpretation that can be quite dramatically different from previous ones. Um, I did see some news articles covering this new study, and in some of those, I think at least some of the authors from the previous paper we talked about, the one that proposed that Protomelacion was a stem bryozoan, were interviewed in them, and they raised the point that this new study is mostly based on new specimens that they consider to be Protomelacion, but they also expressed some skepticism of the fact that maybe these new fossils are not necessarily the same thing as the Protomelacion fossils that they examined. They might be different types of organisms, and I don't have the expertise to really evaluate these fossils, but I think it is interesting to see that kind of discussion play out. So perhaps we will see a follow up to this study eventually.
That's true. Ooh, the plot chickens. Yeah, no, certainly, and that's absolutely fair. And yeah, you are definitely right. I'm sure if we get a follow up response paper, we'll cover that as well. It's that's the nature of science, you know. You make claims, you offer support for those claims, and people will tell you if it's legit or not, and we go from there.
Yep.
So that's really kind of our follow ups here. Albert, I believe you have dibs on the first of our news stories today. Would you like to go ahead?
Seems so. So yeah, let's head on to the next slide, and we'll start going into the actual news portion of our story, or at least the main news stories that we want to talk about. Um, so I thought this was a pretty interesting study to cover, because we often talk about nature documentaries on this channel, and obviously both of us love watching nature documentaries. In fact, I think we both really enjoyed the particular nature documentary that is the subject of this study, which was BBC's The Green Planet. It came out last year, I believe. We like watching nature documentaries because we are really interested in natural history and nature and all things related to that. So of course we would have a good time watching nature documentaries, and of course nature documentaries can have quite a big influence on us. Um, but how much of an impact do nature documentaries have really? Like, do they mostly reach people who are already interested in the subject, or do they have kind of broader scale reach, so to speak? I think that's a very good question, a very fair question to ask, and so it is no surprise that there have been a number of studies that have been done trying to kind of get to the bottom of this. But the thing is, most of those studies have been done on documentaries about animals, and I mean that is fair, right? Because most nature documentaries are going to be about animals. However, we had this big landmark study about plants that came out recently, and so the authors of this study decided to try and evaluate the impact of the green planet. And I think this is quite an important subject to investigate because, after all, plants are essential to human existence, to the existence of pretty much most other life forms on Earth. Certainly, most of the big and charismatic ones that we tend to notice more easily. And yet, like our own awareness of the other life forms on this planet is mostly centered around other animals, and specifically kind of the big and showy animals. And that's understandable because, after all, we are pretty big animals, so we tend to take notice of things that are a bit more like us, speaking in general. And I'm not going to pretend that I'm immune to this. Like, if I go out for a walk, a nature walk, for instance, I have to say, like, I would not be able to identify most of the plants that I see. I could identify probably most of the birds, probably most of the mammals if I'm lucky enough to see any. But yeah, I would not be able to tell you much about the plants, which is a bit of a shame, and it's certainly something I would like to kind of strive to mitigate more. But it is a kind of odd thing because it's not like I'm not interested in plants. I mean, if someone who knows about plants tells me about plants, I would most of the time I think all those facts about plants are very interesting, but it's just not something that I kind of retain as well as I do like knowledge about animals. So I thought the Green Planet was definitely a really really fascinating documentary, and it certainly introduced me to a lot of really interesting plant species and aspects of plant biology. And so what the authors of this study did was that they analyzed Google search trends and also Wikipedia article views in the wake of the broadcast of the Green Planet. Now, the original premiere of the Green Planet was in the UK from January to February of 2022, so last year. And so they focused their kind of analysis to a period of time between January 2021, so a year before the documentary aired, and up to May 2022, so a few months after the documentary aired, so to see what kind of a change they might be able to observe. Now, what they did was that they documented a list of all the species of plants that appeared in Green Planet, at least the ones that were actually identified. And they looked up kind of the search trends and Wikipedia view patterns for these particular species. And what they found was that within a week following the release of relevant episodes that mentioned particular species of plants, internet searches for those plant species did substantially increase. And it's fairly unlikely that this was just a random fluke, because they also compared these search trends in the United States, where during this time period where the documentary had not aired yet. And they did not see this kind of substantial increase when they kind of limited the search to the United States. But in the UK, they did. And not only that, but they also looked for search trends about plant species that were not featured in the documentary, but had been mentioned in popular articles about plants on the internet. And they found that you don't see this kind of same substantial increase in the same time period for those plants that were not featured in the documentary, even though they might have already been, had some popular exposure. So that seems like pretty good evidence that the Green Planet did indeed substantially increase internet searches for the types of plants that were found in the documentary. Furthermore, they were also able to investigate what specific factors influenced search trends, like how these plants were portrayed in the documentary in some ways seemed to have an impact on how many people were searching for them. So one of the biggest factors that influenced this was that plants that received more screen time, like the total amount of time on screen, they measured this out for each species, were more likely to inspire kind of interest in viewers. So more search result or more search attempts essentially. Um, so that's pretty interesting. And so from this, they conclude that just like nature documentaries have been shown to do for animals, nature documentaries can also spread awareness for specific types of plants. So that's really cool, and I think probably a lot of plant scientists should probably be happy about that because it turns out that having a documentary focused on plants can increase people's interest in plants, and that's definitely something we want. At least those of us who are interested in plant biology and conservation want. Now, there have been other studies and that are cited in this article that have concluded that nature documentaries are good for raising awareness of specific species of organisms, but not as much for raising awareness about specific kind of conservation issues, interestingly enough. So it seems that the types of species that are featured in documentaries leave a bigger impression on people than like what kinds of conservation related issues they face, even if those issues are presented in the documentary. But this means that knowing that this is a pattern can help people who make documentaries to tailor their documentaries in a way that perhaps maximizes the potential impact they wanted to have. Because even if people don't retain the specific conservation messages so much, they're probably still going to remember, like, oh, I saw this really cool species on that documentary, and go and look up more information about it. And from there, they might be able to discover more about the types of threats that those species face. And so the authors of this paper propose that perhaps there can be particularly charismatic species of plants that can serve as what they call flagship organisms. So basically, the kind of plant superstars that can be regularly featured on documentaries, and that will inspire people to care more about plants. Not only that particular species of plants, those particular species of plants, but also plants in general, and perhaps the habitats that they live in. And so that seems like an interesting approach that perhaps future documentarians could take advantage of. And kind of as a parallel, we all know that there are superstar species of animals that are regularly featured on documentaries, and that people are very aware of kind of perhaps the at least the in general terms, the threats that they face and their general natural history. So obviously things like polar bears and giant pandas and lions and such come to mind, a lot of big predators. So perhaps we can find some kind of equivalent among plants as well. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of great to see a study like this in the first place, where we've been talking a lot about the importance of nature documentaries, and now we're actually getting the data that's not just viewership,
Mm-hmm.
that can actually inform us about how well these series are doing. I'm particularly drawn to the finding that the plants with more screen time in the series
Mm.
seem to inspire more interest. Because I look back on all of the at least in this case, the BBC series that I've seen, including all the David Attenborough ones that he produced himself. And I'm very curious now about what those had done, even
Mm-hmm.
going all the way back to when like this trend, if you like, kind of first started. Because to this day, one of my favorites of the Attenborough Life series, and I can actually say this now because I marathoned all of them last year,
Nice.
as kind of a personal fun thing, is the first one, Life on Earth.
Mm.
Um, but that one is very didactic,
Right.
and its kind of approach to showcasing species is, I would argue, kind of out of date nowadays
Mm.
for for nature documentaries, um, because you kind of have a stop and go approach where certain organisms are used as examples more than others.
Right.
So, like when or the young David Attenborough is talking about, the evolutionary history of primates, and he kind of just goes through all of these different lemurs and monkeys and apes, and kind of like a quick succession, right?
Yeah.
Like, and here we have Langer. Oh, and here's a macaque.
Right.
And it kind of goes very fast.
Yeah.
And like I can see why he's doing that for the purposes of that particular documentary, where he's explaining principles in evolution and natural history, and then he's showing examples of how a group has diversified over time. Which kind of goes back to the early um, quote that opens the series. That at the time, there are 4 million types of plants and animals in the world. That's 4 million ways of being alive on Earth. Um, so I'm wondering, like, I mean, obviously, like the internet was not a factor
Yeah.
in the in the late '70s. So I guess you can't really look at it that way. But I'm
Right.
I'm curious to how viewers responded to the individual organisms themselves,
Hmm.
in the way that this paper has been trying to look at. Um, because I know that Life on Earth, when it first aired, was a huge success. It was
Yeah.
very popular, and a bunch of countries got it as well. So it got around. Um, but in terms of like raising people's interest enough to do their own research and look up books and websites and things about the animals and plants that featured, I don't know. I'm very curious.
Yeah.
Um, 'Cause like that is like the like in terms of like the presentation style, like yeah, that has changed. And like we've talked about this outside of the show, but consider say Life on Earth when they show a Komodo dragon. I
Hmm.
forget if they actually showed Komodo dragons in that show or not, but it's kind of like they cut right to the animal. You see the whole thing.
Yep.
Attenborough talks about a behavior or a life way or the features, and he moves on. Whereas something like Planet Earth 2, where the Islands episode, which is
Hmm.
what opened that series, you got to have the long pan through
Yeah.
the island. You got to go up the tail of the lizard as it's slowly walking along the beach, and then you see maybe an eye or a flick of the tongue, and
Hmm.
then gradually you come out, and then you get the whole Komodo dragon, and that takes up like 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So
Right.
um, clearly, things have changed a lot since
Hmm.
the early days of the landmark natural history series, and like that. Now that I'm seeing a study like this, now I'm very curious about the progress through time. How we got to this point, in terms of cinematography and storytelling approaches, and what that has done for the general public
Hmm.
who are not specialists in natural history, and how they view these different animals and plants. So yeah, it's kind of a long way of kind of a long way of me saying I'd like to see more research like this, especially in a historical context as well.
Yeah. Me too. And that example that you gave regarding the difference in documentary presentation style between then and now, I think that was also mentioned by the science writer Ed Young when he reviewed, I think it was Planet Earth 2, I believe. In fact, I believe he also used specifically the Komodo dragon as an example,
Oh, okay. Maybe I'm
which
kind of
is
subconsciously remembering it.
yeah, maybe. And in his article, he was kind of somewhat critical of that presentation style. And when I was reading it, I could definitely sympathize because basically what he was saying was that there's so much focus on kind of the visuals and like cinematography in these modern documentaries, but it feels like there's a lot less emphasis on the actual information. Um, but I mean, if we take the results of this study, it may be that maybe this kind of presentation style can be beneficial, at least when it comes to raising awareness for specific species. Like if you're giving them more screen time, more literally more time in the limelight, so to speak. Maybe that is something that documentaries could continue to take advantage of. And certainly, watching The Green Planet, I was struck by how cinematic a lot of the shots were. It just looked incredible. Like I think it was a really dynamic way of showing plant biology. And so even if we have to sacrifice some of the kind of the amount of information that gets into these documentaries, at least a little bit, maybe it's not such a bad thing that we can show nature in this way in this day and age.
Yeah, and like even like regarding plant life, it is just kind of a fun thing to talk about how you can make documentaries about plants, and they have just as much excitement and cinematography and presentation style as say documentaries about animal life. I
Mm-hmm.
mean,
Yeah.
just comparing the Green Planet to Another one of Attenborough's
Mm-hmm.
works, The Private Life of Plants,
Yep.
which I think that was a 90s production.
Yes.
Um, but that was back when, while this was not a new approach, because I know some of the Disney True Life Adventures did this as well. Kind of the approach of doing time lapse photography
Mm-hmm.
to kind of highlight the living bodies of the plants. Um, Definitely goes a long way into helping
Yeah.
kind of promote, you know, their understanding for the general public. Because I mean, unless you're a gardener who is able to like spout scientific names on a whim and is very attentive to the plants, for most folks, I imagine you walk through the woods or even in your front lawn, and the plants are just kind of there.
Right.
You know, they grow, they look pretty. Some of them are weeds, some of them, stick to your jeans, but like they're they're almost as I mean they are as dynamic and moving as animals are. And I feel like documentaries like this really help kind of drive that point home because plants, sense the world in a sense many different ways that animals do, but they
Mm-hmm.
still have their own ways to do it
Yep.
that often parallel the way that animals look at the world. And the more you kind of look into that sort of thing, the more you realize that the tree on your front lawn that you've looked at forever is has as much energy and drive as the bird that's perched on it.
Mm-hmm.
It just goes through a different time scale
Right.
than the bird or you do. So it's kind of neat that we've gotten to this point
Yeah,
where we can
definitely.
have something like the Green Planet.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating to me. But yeah, definitely. This is an extraordinary paper, and I definitely want to dig more into it as well and see if I can find other papers like that to kind of compare it to. Because now my curiosity is super piqued. Kind of excited. Um, but unless there's anything else you wanted to add, we can move on now to my first story.
Yeah, let's do that.
All right, sure. So this is an anthropological story for a change. We've talked about the different expansions of peoples across the Pacific Islands over the last 60,000 years or so on this series. And I've given perhaps a little time to the subsequent societies and cultures of the islands, but we really haven't explored Pacific sociocultural anthropology at all yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so this paper by Guillaume Moll and colleagues offers a fascinating example of such research in the modern sense. So the coral reefs of the Pacific Islands make up over half the world's coral biomass. Something on the order of over 10,000 reefs accompany the various island groups here. As such, Pacific Islanders from Sahul to Rapa Nui have utilized the stony corals, or the scleractinians, wherever they have settled. And while a lot of archaeological and greater anthropological work has been done in working with Pacific Island groups to understand how corals were used in, say, the construction of homes or in tools for catching and preparing meals, not a whole lot of research has been done in
Mm-hmm.
understanding the ritual uses and purposes of corals. These had been known about, of course, through oral traditions and ethnography, but there is little in the way of seeing trends or functions or frameworks as a greater whole, as had been done with other materials like wood or stone. So to try to combat this, Moll and colleagues synthesized information from just a few select island groups in the Pacific, and the map here highlights them. So moving from left to right, they look at the Torres Strait Islands between New Guinea and Australia. They look at New Caledonia and the accompanying islands there, and they look at French Polynesia. So that's the Marquesas, the Society Islands, the Austral Islands, and Tuamotu. And they look through a combination of archaeological and ethnographic records and oral traditions to see what types of stony corals were used, how they were used, what contexts they were used in, and their significance in any ritual practices and belief systems across the islands that were sampled. And so I'll highlight some of those here. But if you want to see the full survey that the authors give, this is quite a hefty paper. we recommend checking it out. We'll have the link in the description, and it's open access. So they start in French Polynesia, or as they call it here, Central East Polynesia. This area of the Pacific is quite important in a historical context, as many of the outlying islands like Hawaii and Rapa Nui were settled from various points here within the last 1,200 years. Oral traditions and ethnography tell of certain corals, like the genus Acropora, that symbolize aspects of creation. So in Tahiti, coral, alongside the plant life that grows on the land on the islands, are used as perfect metaphors for the growth of the universe, as the gods used them as the foundations of the earth and the sky. And so they also function heavily in the construction of the mare. These are well defined spaces where groups of people under a chief may perform various rituals. So, to quote the authors, the mare was seen as a petrified voyaging canoe, anchoring the identity of the community on the land. And in conjunction with the creation stories, the people often incorporated coral into the foundations of the structures, often in the form of coral blocks. And you can see in the photo here to the far right an example of this. There were instances on islands like Moorea where different coral types were actually used in different parts of the mare's construction, to the point where the local language contained distinct words for the types of blocks used. And even when it came to the color of the coral, there were important functions. So, for example, red and white coral blocks symbolized concepts of the sacred and of death. Now, as coral stones were placed in the construction of a new mare, a chief would memorialize his lineage, his accomplishments, and alliances for future generations. So, taken all together, the mare represent spiritual places of remarkable significance, not just to the people, but to the ocean itself from which the coral came. So then, of course, the authors turn to New Caledonia, and they state that this particular island group seems to have used coral the least out of the regions surveyed. And if so, it mainly came down to use in construction of funerary mounds or defensive structures called zaka that protected gardens from the elements.
Hmm.
However, the ethnographic record does describe an aspect of the Karnak cultural complex. So this is an archaeological culture that encompasses the last millennium. That being the magical objects called haz. Now, while many of these were made of rocks or fossils or repurposed tools, there do exist coral variants. Now, on the island of Lifu, for example, anthropologists noted a haz made of Gorgonacea limestone that was circled with various marine animals and algae, so like barnacles and shells, that could be used to like kill somebody, for example. Now, there was also a haz that could aid in the recovery of a lost item. Now, the practice of these magic stones, these coral stones, seems to be quite widespread actually across New Caledonia, as well as neighboring islands like Vanuatu and the Banks Islands, where they're seen as the, quote, sacred stones of the sea, which is, in a sense, what a piece of stony coral is. Now, some coral stones could also be carved into representations of deities. The carving at the bottom center image here, that shows a Loupe, who is a male spirit, who's sitting on the head of an unnamed woman, and that itself is resting on a stone coral base. Now, the base is important. One was never supposed to remove the sculpture from the base, and the authors state that the Swiss anthropologist who described these particular pieces, Fritz Saracen, while kind of dubiously argued that, and I'm quoting here, the effigy may cause harm to a specific person if the male part is spat on, but if it is the female, then the person should heal. So even in this region of the Pacific where coral does not factor into, say, major construction works like mare, there were still ritual uses for them.
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, we get to the Torres Strait Islands, where the people descended from New Guinean groups that settled farther south and represent one of the only pre-European contact groups to establish relations with Aboriginal Australians. Coral shows up in far more ritual contexts. In some brief examples, Coral stones carved into the shape of specific animals could be used to bring greater magic, or what they call a miseri, to hunters wishing to exploit the resembled animals, just forming these kind of vital connections. Corals, as well as shells and rocks, could be used in the construction of great ritual installations that function like maps, which match the journeys of specific ancestors across regions. And coral could also be crushed and mixed with turtle grease and other liquids to be used as funerary paints. So they would change the person into a spirit of the dead, called a lamar or a markai. So the coral sculpture here shown at the left is a beggar, which is a human-shaped figure that was placed in a fire to keep it going while people were away from the camp.
Hmm.
So where does all this, and of course more that's described in the paper, lead us? Well, the sheer diversity of coral shaping techniques for ritual purposes, be it making coral bricks, or shaping coral into sculptures, or turning it into paint, led the authors to conclude that there were often more personal reasons for using corals in these ways than just pure economic or practical reasons.
Hmm.
So just because a society lives near a coral reef ecosystem doesn't necessarily mean that the corals themselves are going to have to be used to the fullest extent possible. I mean, look at New Caledonia, for example.
Hmm.
And we see this clearly in parts of French Polynesia, where the incorporation of these coral elements into the otherwise stone-built mare doesn't really make sense if you try to use a purely practical or ecological context, because otherwise they would just make the whole foundations out of coral,
Hmm.
but they don't. So whether that be with cosmology, recognition of ancestors, or the greater environment, it's all about these symbolic connections. The transfer of corals to the land highlighted a connection between these realms, particularly in societies where the two are so intertwined that the ocean itself could be considered the ancestral mare from which all originally came. And as the authors state, quote, such cosmogonic principles justify the sacredness attached to coral material, and therefore drove a multitude of, but non-exclusive, ritual functions, materializing the sacred in the landscape, realizing kinships, honoring the ancestors, and interacting with the deities in many ways through offerings and manipulations of objects. So, while the authors don't really go into this aspect, I do definitely think that such a wide-ranging sacredness of so many coral species should underpin our conservation efforts for coral reefs in the Pacific Ocean. I mean, for example, between 2009 and 2018, the world had actually lost 14% of its coral reefs. And while the threat of coral bleaching seems to actually be kind of waning a bit in recent years, as more groups have looked at coral reefs that have recovered from coral bleaching, and they find that there's actually some resistance that can be gained from the corals themselves, which is great. Conservation groups should nevertheless continue to preserve and protect these regions for future generations. And of course, that's especially and prominently for the Pacific Islanders who still hold the coral reefs in their hearts and minds.
Hmm.
So I thought this was a particularly uh, fascinating paper, especially in terms of sociocultural anthropology, which no doubt has an extraordinarily rich literature that has changed over the years, and it certainly continues to impact research today. So I quite enjoyed this quite a bit, especially if this is a fascinating part of the world. What do you think, Albert?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating too. It is always interesting to learn about the cultural significance of particular types of organisms, especially those that perhaps you personally are not so familiar with. So of course, those of us who don't live near coral reefs, like it is interesting to find out how do the people who live in those regions interact with or make use of resources like that. And I also found it really interesting the significance of personal preference and symbolic functions in the use of these corals too, because that is part of what makes culture so interesting, isn't it? It's like there is a big component of personal kind of preference to it, and that's how we have so many different and diverse cultures around now. So yeah, it's definitely something where kind of sheer practicality is not the only thing we have to consider, and sometimes kind of the most interesting aspect can be that people use certain things because they like those things. Like it's something that they get joy out of. That's definitely something that's quite noteworthy. And I also like the emphasis on kind of preserving the cultural value, or like having cultural value be one of the reasons to encourage conservation of these corals, because that's definitely something that I feel that at least those of us in the English speaking Western world haven't always emphasized so much when we talk about conservation. Oftentimes we talk about conserving organisms for their ecological value or direct benefits to us, or kind of the inherent value of life, and all of those are really important factors, important motivators for conserving the natural world. But certainly there's also the cultural value of organisms for the people who live alongside them, and that is also really important, because if we want to preserve those cultures as very distinctive and unique cultures that have developed again out of serendipity or personal preference, definitely it is also very important to conserve the kind of natural resources or organisms that they are based around. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely a lot to think about when it comes to this study, and I definitely appreciate that you picked it for this episode.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad. Um, yeah, and like you bring up some very interesting points for sure. Even just kind of commenting on the distinction between the recognition of value in natural objects in like indigenous communities in the Pacific versus like in Euro-American societies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there is like a huge gap between the two. I mean, in terms of like Europe, for example, I mean, I think about how like J.R. Tolkien wrote the Lord of the Rings universe as a way to kind of fill in the gaps
Hmm.
for like Europeans at the time that he wrote those books, because a lot of those spiritual and mythic links to the land were very abruptly stamped out over the years up to that point, to where all of those connections that could have been there for Europeans just weren't.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like all the Celtic and Germanic groups that lived there prior to like Roman occupation. I mean, like those were all stamped out and changed dramatically,
Mm.
um, despite what a lot of groups today would like to try. Um, and of course, in the later years, like the advent of Christianity in Europe really changed how people viewed the landscape
Right.
with their particular interpretations of the Hebrew writings. You know, the idea that nature is something that man must subdue and because he owns it, you know, like that sort of mentality, which has certainly done a lot of, you know, negativity for conservation efforts. I mean, look at the European wild landscape today. I mean, there's still some of it there, but just, you know, centuries of just intensive use and justification for that use have just destroyed much of the environments. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, most of the old growth forests are gone, for example. So yeah, it's an interesting perspective when we read, you know, ethnographies, for example, that talk about indigenous groups like in the Pacific or in the pre-colonial Americas that have held on despite all of the influences of colonialism to these belief systems and practices, and the records of those practices, and how that has helped keep those environments that they have lived in, you know, so diverse
Mm-hmm.
and healthy for so long. It gives us a lot of lessons to look into and to kind of reflect on. And of course, like a study like this is also just another kind of nail in the coffin for the idea of strict environmental determinism. Of course, you know, while environments do pose certain limitations to groups of people who live in them, they don't create the cultures.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's like a feedback loop
Yep.
in a
Mm.
sense. So yeah, definitely very glad to have found this paper, and I'm glad I was able to kind of provide some insights for you. That's always that's what I hope to do for our show and for all of our viewers watching as well. Certainly, we want to encourage conversation as well. So if there are any viewers who are Pacific Islander who want to weigh in on this, we're more than happy to hear what you have to say, and maybe we can learn some more as well.
Yeah.
So that's my first story. Albert, would you like to present your second one?
Yeah, let's do that. So my next story is sort of like an indulgent one for me because it means I get to talk about alvarezsaurs again. So yeah, so I guess for those of you who on the off chance are not familiar with alvarezsaurs, well, I guess I shouldn't say on the off chance because they're not particularly well known. However, if you've been following my work for long enough, you probably are familiar with alvarezsaurs because the avatar that I use on this show and pretty much everywhere else online for that matter is an alvarezsaur. It's a Albertonicus, which lived in the late Cretaceous of Canada. Specifically, it was found in Alberta, hence the name. Now, alvarezsaurs were a group of very interesting and strange dinosaurs. So they were a group of Maniraptoran theropod dinosaurs. So they're members of like the big group of meat-eating dinosaurs. And specifically as Maniraptorans, they are pretty closely related to birds. So Maniraptora is a group that includes birds, but also some of their closest relatives among the other dinosaurs, and alvarezsaurs are one of them. So these would have been these alvarezsaurs would have been these mostly small, feathery theropods that were around. They're best known from the late Cretaceous, but we know they were around earlier than that. And the latest living alvarezsaurs, the ones that are best studied from the late Cretaceous, had some really strange features. First of all, most of them were very small. On average, they were around the size of a chicken or a turkey, and they got even smaller than that too. Some species seemed to have only been around the size of a pigeon. The biggest alvarezsaurs could get fairly big, the size of a rhea or an emu, something like that. But by dinosaurian standards, that's still not very big. So yeah, these were small theropods, and in the later forms, one of their strangest features were their forelimbs. So their forelimbs were incredibly short. They were tiny little forelimbs. And yet, you would be hard-pressed to say that they were completely useless, because they, in fact, have some parts of the forelimb were actually very well developed, despite the short length of the forelimbs themselves. So specifically, there were some really big attachment points for muscles on these forelimbs, and also one of the claws on their hands was extremely enlarged, whereas the other fingers were reduced. As Maniraptoran theropods, alvarezsaurs ancestrally had 3 fingers, and most of them, kept 3 fingers until the very end. But 2 of those fingers were so tiny that at first glance you might think that they were not even there at all. And it was only basically the equivalent of the thumb that was kind of greatly enlarged, and so it had this big claw on it. So basically, kind of. These dinosaurs I've heard them described as having all thumbs because it's just the thumb that was emphasized in these hands. And some of them, in fact, do seem to have actually lost the 2 smaller fingers entirely. And so they really just had like one single finger with a big claw on each of their hands. Very strange. And kind of in contrast to this, they also have quite long legs, so we think they were pretty good runners for their size. And their heads were they were relatively delicate. They in many ways they've been described as being bird-like, and in fact, we used to think that they were even more closely related to birds than we currently do. In fact, it used to be thought that they might have had ancestrally flying ancestors, and they kind of reverted to a kind of flightless lifestyle, similar to things like a kiwi or like ostriches have among modern birds. But we now think that this is not the case; that they were a bit more distantly related to birds. Their ancestors were flightless all along, but still, they would have looked pretty bird-like. And so, kind of one of the biggest mysteries about alvarezsaur biology is what they were using these big claws on these short little forelimbs for anyway. And And by far the most popular explanation has been that these forelimbs were probably used to break into really hard objects, and specifically probably things like insect nests. And we actually do see this in certain types of animals today. A lot of pangolins and anteaters and some types of armadillos also have like these really robust forelimbs with a single claw that is greatly enlarged, and they certainly use their forelimbs in this way to kind of claw open hard insect nests, and so they could feed on insects inside. Mostly in modern day, these would be things like termites and ants. Um, and yet, these animals don't have kind of forelimbs that are reduced to the same degree as they are in alvarezsaurs, and we think there are some possible reasons for that. But even considering that discrepancy, this particular combination of traits, like the particular muscle attachments that are enlarged, the fact that there is a single very enlarged claw, and the fact that all the bones in the forelimb are very robust, and most of the joints in the forelimb have kind of a reduced range of motion, except for the one that flexes that big claw. All of these features are found in animals that kind of dig into insect nests in the way that I've just described. And so this has been kind of the leading hypothesis for how alvarezsaurs were using their forelimbs. And in fact, if you've seen season 1 of Prehistoric Planet, you've seen this in action with the Mononicus segment, which is a type of alvarezsaur. Yeah. Be sure to check that out if you haven't already, because that's definitely a really, really wonderful depiction of what we think that alvarezsaurs were like. Now, this study was actually not only about alvarezsaurs, but they also looked at another group of maniraptor and theropods that in some ways were very different. These were the therizinosaurs. And therizinosaurs also had very strange forelimbs, and not to mention strange everything else about their anatomy, but they were strange in a very different way from the alvarezsaurs, because therizinosaurs tend to have like relatively long forelimbs, not short ones, and they also had big claws, but instead of just a single one, they had all the claws on their hands were enlarged. So these are also 3-fingered hands, so they had 3 big claws on each of their hands. And they were unusual in other ways too. So they had relatively small heads on very long neck, and their teeth don't seem to have been well built for eating meat. And so, unlike most other types of theropods, it's thought that therizinosaurs are primarily plant-eating animals. Their hind limbs were not very well built for fast running either. They had very wide bodies, probably to kind of increase the amount of gut space that they had to digest fibrous plants. And so it seems fairly convincing that therizinosaurs were a group of primarily plant-eating theropods. But even so, they still have such a strange combination of traits that we are not quite sure exactly how they function in many ways, and especially what exactly they were using those big claws for. Now, a number of ideas have been proposed. Like some people in the past have proposed that therizinosaurs are also digging for insects, for example, or maybe just digging in general. Maybe they made burrows. Pretty interesting ideas. But overall, compared to the alvarezsaurs, their forelimbs don't have as many similarities to kind of ant-eating animals. So it seems that the insect digging idea, at least for most therizinosaurs, is not so highly regarded these days. Another possibility that perhaps fits more in with the herbivorous habits is that maybe they were using the claws to pull vegetation towards themselves to make it easier to reach those that kind of plant material. And this is something that we don't necessarily see in modern animals, but until very recently we did have another group of herbivorous animals that seem to have lived in a similar way, and these were extinct sloths. So a lot of sloths in the past were not so much like the sloths that we have alive today, but instead were mostly ground-dwelling animals, and they could get to really big sizes, many of them the size of rhinos, some of them got the size of elephants, and they also, like modern tree sloths, had big claws on their hands, but since most of these guys were too big to climb, probably what they were doing with those claws was kind of reaching for branches and pulling them down while they were feeding. And probably those claws were also useful in defense against predators too, since these big sloths, they also don't seem to have been very good at running. and being sloths, they probably had a relatively low metabolism for a mammal. They probably couldn't get away from predators very easily, but with those big claws, they might have been able to protect themselves at least often enough to survive. And so, probably it is at least widely suspected that therizinosaurs were doing something similar with the claws, probably using them to reach for vegetation and to defend themselves against meat-eating theropods if necessary. However, there has been relatively limited study, like actually testing these ideas of what these claws were used for, especially for alvarezsaurs. Like with alvarezsaurs, mostly people have just looked at kind of the features that these forelimbs have and kind of just qualitatively said, yeah, these are similar to features we see in certain types of modern animals, so they might have been used in a similar way. But no one has done like modeling studies to actually like figure out whether or not these claws were actually like suitable for performing such behaviors. And therizinosaurs, there was one previous study that did do kind of modeling studies on their claws, but that was a single study. So obviously we could always use more and more detailed kind of studies when it comes to examining these questions. And so the authors of this new paper decided to do just that. So they basically modeled a bunch of therizinosaur and alvarezsaur claws and then tried to test them. Test their performance at performing different types of behaviors. Now they used a method called finite element analysis. I've talked about this method before at some points on the show, but just to review briefly, this was a method that was originally used, and it's still used in engineering to test the strength of structural support in buildings, for example, how much weight a certain structure can withstand, things like that. And what it does is that it breaks down complex shapes into like individual smaller, simpler shapes. So these are the elements that finite element analysis refers to. And you can specify what these elements are made of. So, for example, they could be concrete or steel, or in this case, bone. And then you can test by applying like different types of forces onto different parts of the object, kind of model how the object will behave under specific scenarios. And doing this, when we apply this to kind of looking at biomechanics of organisms, for example, you can kind of model the specific scenarios, the specific types of forces that a certain structure would experience during certain behaviors, and then see how well suited that structure actually is to performing those behaviors. And so with the alvarezsaur and therizinosaur claws, the authors of the study used finite element analysis to test their performance under 3 different scenarios. And these are kind of pictured on the figure here. You can kind of see them. Maybe they're kind of small and inset figures, so it might not be too clear, but they are there. So the 3 different scenarios, number 1 was piercing, so kind of using the tip of the claw, the sharp tip, to kind of puncture an object. That's something that a lot of meat-eating animals use their claws for, to kind of hook into the flesh of their prey and grab hold of them. Then there is the hooking and pulling, and so this is kind of what a lot of people suspect therizinosaurs were using their claws primarily for. So that would be like you apply the claw to the top of an object and kind of pull it down. So perhaps they were doing this on tree branches, for example. So that would be applying a force to the bottom of the claws. And finally, scratch digging. So you would be like scratching against a hard substrate to kind of shovel out the soil or whatever it is made of. And so that is the 3rd scenario that they tested. So that would be kind of dragging the tip of the claw against something. Okay, so then doing this, they could at least make some interpretations about how good each of these claws would have been for each of these actions. Now, what did they find? Well, they not only analyzed the claws of therizinosaurs and alvarezsaurs, but they also compared kind of modeling results to a few types of mammals, most of which we know what the claws are used for. And they also compared these to kind of so-called quote-unquote more normal-looking theropods. So they had an Allosaurus, a big Jurassic meat-eater, and Guanlong, which is an early Tyrannosaur. And so these theropods had more kind of normal-looking theropod claws that we think perhaps were useful in predation for grabbing onto prey, and kind of compared those to alvarezsaurs and therizinosaurs to see what types of differences there might have been. And to visualize the results, they came up with these graphs on the figure here. And so these graphs are a bit complex, but I think they're a pretty novel and an interesting way of showing the results here, because what they did was that they tested these three different functions, right? And so to visualize the difference in how well suited the claws were for each of these functions, they plotted them out as these triangles for each species of animal. So you can see on the graph that there are all these different triangles that are connected by 3 points each. And so these 3 points on each of the triangles represent like how well each of these claws were functioning in each of these scenarios. And to determine how well they were functioning, this is basically color-coded, which is a common practice in finite element analysis. So things that are kind of plot towards the redder end of the graph here are experiencing very high stresses when they are performing these actions, and so we would usually assume that things that plot in high stresses during these actions would not be well suited to these actions because they'd be experiencing a lot of stress. Whereas if you plot closer to the kind of the blue and purple end of the spectrum, that means the claws are not experiencing so much stress, and so potentially they might still be relatively well suited for these kinds of behaviors. So that's what's going on here. All right, so first of all, what do we see in the mammals for which we know what the claw functions were? So the 4 types of mammals they have here are a puma or cougar or whatever else you want to call it, mountain lion, whatever. Or then there's a pangolin, an anteater, specifically a tamandua, which is a climbing anteater, and also a giant ground sloth that is extinct. And so what they found was that the puma basically had a pretty large triangle when the claws were tested in all these different functions. A large triangle means that the claw is behaving very differently when it does all these different types of functions. Essentially, probably the claw does much better at one of these functions than the other. Now, that being said, you can see that the puma triangle is plotting entirely within the kind of purple and blue zone, so it's not experiencing too much stress for each of these, but it's probably like not particularly good at some of these functions compared to others. And now pumas mostly use the claws to help them capture prey, being a relatively large cat species after all. They also use the claws for climbing with, and so these claws are relatively multifunctional, but perhaps not so specialized for some of these particular functions. Now the pangolin has a pretty interesting triangle. In fact, it doesn't really look like a triangle at all. In fact, it looks like a straight line. And so what's going on here is that the pangolin claw not only experiences low stresses for each of these functions, but it also the way the claw behaves is not so different between each of these functions. And perhaps the digging function, it's experiencing more stress because inherently, if you're dragging the claw across something, you're going to give it more stress. But in terms of like comparing these 3 different functions in general, the claw itself is not behaving so differently for each of them. So potentially the claw would be pretty good at doing all of these different functions. The giant ground sloth actually kind of plots in the middle. It's got a sort of moderately sized triangle. It's not quite a straight line like the pangolin's is, but it's not quite as big as the puma's triangle. And like I mentioned earlier, we think that giant ground sloths were using the claws mostly for hooking and pulling. We also know some of them use them for digging too. We know some of them make burrows, and probably also for predator defense. And finally, we have the tamandua, the climbing anteater. And the climbing anteater also has like a pretty narrow triangle. So similar to the pangolin in that regard. So both of these are ant-eating mammals that would use the claws for breaking open ant nests. But because perhaps because I'm kind of speculating here, perhaps because the tamandua also uses its claws for climbing, it needs to compromise a bit, and so its claws kind of plot out in sort of moderately stressed zone here, even though it's able to do all those different functions. So that's pretty interesting. So those are the mammals that are used for comparison. Then we come to kind of letter B, and these are the 2 kind of normal theropods, quote unquote, the guanlong and allosaurus, and we see that their claws have like pretty big triangles, kind of similar to the pumas in that regard. And in that way, it's kind of expected because these two would have been kind of perhaps claws that we think are useful for predation. And so it's also kind of showing up as a very similar kind of signal here. How these large triangles kind of plotting out mostly towards the low stress end of the graph. So perhaps they are able to use these claws for all these different functions, but they're not particularly specialized for most of them. And then finally, the next graph we have in red, the alvarezsaurs. Now, we know that it is the later species of alvarezsaurs that have these kind of very specialized forelimbs, whereas earlier species from the Jurassic kind of looked like a lot more like normal theropods, really. And it turns out that this is borne out in kind of the claw function measurements here. Early alvarezsaurs had kind of these relatively big triangles, similar to the puma, similar to like the normal theropods earlier. But when we look at the later alvarezsaurs, especially things like, what did they look at here? I think Lincolnicus and Mononicus. Now you might not even be able to make out the triangles here. So these would be like way to the left here, numbers 6 and 7. They have very narrow triangles and very short triangles too, like even compared to the pangolin from earlier. So their claws were plotting like way in the low stress area of the graph, and similar to the pangolin, the triangle kind of plots out as essentially a straight line in Lincolnicus and Mononicus, and so they had very similar kind of claw behavior to the pangolin, and so this further supports the idea that these alvarezsaurs were engaging in a similar type of behavior to the pangolin, where they were digging open ant nests. And it's not just that too, because compared to the earlier alvarezsaurs, we see that earlier alvarezsaurs with their kind of very broad triangles, they would have been pretty decent at piercing and hooking and pulling. But not so great by comparison for digging. Whereas in the later alvarezsaurs, we see a noticeable improvement in the digging behavior. So this kind of further supports the idea that they were being specifically selected to be better at digging, and so this was very likely what they were actually using their claws for. Now, it is pretty curious, isn't it, that we have the pangolin and these later alvarezsaurs, even though we think that the claws are mostly for digging, they also happen to be pretty suited to kind of piercing and hooking and pulling. And the authors point out that this is because digging is not a very simple kind of behavior, right? It's not just about kind of scratching out the soil. You also need to be able to puncture the substrate in the first place, so there's a piercing component to it. You need to be able to kind of shovel out the loose soil too, so there's a sort of hooking and pulling component to that too. And so it makes sense for kind of digging specialized animals, especially those that are breaking into these hard ant nests or these insect nests, to be good at all three of these functions. This actually is in line with what, if you think about it, with what we would expect of claws like these. And finally, on the bottom in purple are the therizinosaur claws, and most of the therizinosaur claws kind of plot out in a similar region to the giant ground sloth from earlier. So they have moderately sized triangles, kind of in the middle of the graph here, in the middle stress zone. So that's mostly consistent with what we thought about their claws before. But there is one major outlier, like even compared to all the other animals that we've looked at so far. And those are the gigantic claws of Therizinosaurus. So this was the biggest of the therizinosaurs. It was like, almost as big as a T-Rex. And it's got the longest known claws of any known animal. The claws, as preserved, were about 90 centimeters long, and if they had the kind of the keratinous sheath over them, probably they would have been like a meter long in total or more. So huge claws. And of course, these are some of the claws that are most fascinating to people. Like, what on earth could such big claws have been used for? And it turns out that Therizinosaurus plots very far away from all the other therizinosaurs, and for that matter, all the other animals that they looked at in this study. If you look way on the right here on this graph, Therizinosaurus has this little triangle, actually it's a relatively wide triangle, way deep into the high stress zone here. And so what this indicates, at least according to results of the study, is that the claws of Therizinosaurus were not very well suited to piercing, hooking, and pulling, or digging with. So what on earth could they have used these claws for? Well, there are a few possibilities. First of all is that they were used for something that just wasn't tested in this study. Obviously, animals use their claws in all kinds of ways. So there are plenty of different scenarios that this study has not tested that perhaps the therizinosaurus could have used its claws for. But one idea that the authors raise in this study is that perhaps the claws of therizinosaurs were not mostly used for any kind of mechanical function at all, which is quite a wild idea. They suggest that maybe it was using these claws primarily for display, which would be a really interesting idea. When you first hear about this idea, you might think like, yeah, that seems odd. Why have such big claws just for displaying purposes? But on the other hand, it's like if it wasn't mechanically functional for most of these common claw purposes, and yet they were so big, like this would be expected of structures that are for primarily visual display. If they're big, they're showy and easier to see, right? So maybe, yeah, maybe there is something to this that these claws are used for display purposes, and that doesn't mean they couldn't be used to, like, say, scare off a predator for intimidation purposes. Just that perhaps they weren't so much actively used as weapons as such, and certainly something the size of Therizinosaurus could have been pretty dangerous, like whether or not it had like actual specialized weapons or not. So maybe it just didn't really need kind of big claws for killing other things with. Like just its size alone, perhaps, would have been a decent deterrent. Yeah, it's a really interesting idea. I definitely would like to see more studies done on kind of the claws of Therizinosaurus, especially to kind of test this further, because this is a bit counterintuitive that it wasn't performing very well under any of these scenarios. Finally, I know I went on for quite a while there, but I do want to raise something else that made me very happy about this study. It wasn't just the fact that it was about alvarezsaurs, but also the lead author of this paper, Qing Zichuan, he basically did his PhD specifically looking at alvarezsaur biology, and so I've had a lot of really great conversations with him because I'm also interested in that topic, even though I don't personally like focus on alvarezsaurs as a research subject. But not just that, he was actually inspired to do this study because he read a blog article I wrote about alvarezsaurs. I think I've mentioned this in the past, but a couple years ago I basically wrote this huge blog post talking about like how alvarezsaurs might have lived, kind of synthesizing all the available evidence that we have. And at the end of the article, I kind of wrote a little paragraph saying that, well, so far seems like the best supported idea for alvarezsaurs, at least according to my own interpretation of the literature. But there are so many more studies that could be done to test this. And one of the ideas I suggested was that people could use finite element analysis to test how suited alvarezsaur claws were for in this case, kind of digging through insect nests. And that's exactly what Qing Zichuan did in this study, because he had read that blog post of mine. And so if you read the acknowledgments of this study, I'm mentioned in it because he wanted to credit me for kind of having these conversations with him and giving him this idea, I suppose. So I'm very very grateful that he did that, and I'm really pleased to see that my kind of musings back there kind of bore fruit in this regard. I think there probably is no higher honor for a humble blog post like that, at least from a science blogging perspective, than to have inspired an actual scientific study. So thanks so much for taking that on board, Chin. And I'm really glad to see the study, just the experimental design, the results. I'm all very happy with the fact that it's about alvarezsaurs. I'm of course very happy with, and so I definitely wanted a chance to talk about it on this show. If you haven't fallen asleep there, what do you think?
Oh no, I think it's fantastic, and yeah, I'm happy for you as well. No, like biomechanical studies like this are really fascinating, and I think it's kind of neat to see just more support. Like for example, for the use of the alvarezsaur hands.
Mm-hmm.
Like we've talked on the show a little bit about this, about how like first impressions of alvarezsaurs, it's like these arms were probably useless. They didn't have any basic function. They're just so bizarre. And like to hear suggestions like, oh, maybe they were used for digging at first, this kind of raises eyebrows. Like, wait, what? Really? It's so
Right.
tiny. You have to like hug an ant mound or something.
Yeah.
But of course, like as you've explained so brilliantly, like it's actually like pretty easy to do, and like there's a lot of examples in nature here that can help kind of provide more insights into how those hands and claws were used. So It's great to see like further support about this. Um, I will comment though that this is one of those papers that I've been seeing around, and while folks seem to be like happy about it, they kind of ignore all the other aspects about it
Yeah.
to focus on therizinosaurus.
Yep.
Um, because like it's one of those dinosaurs. Like it's not like Brontosaurus or Stegosaurus
Mm.
where like it has a huge pop culture presence. It's like a second tier under that,
Right.
or it's just well known enough that paleo media tends to feature it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, what do you do with a giant animal with friggin' Grim Reaper hands? We have it slashing its way through enemies
Yeah.
and
Right.
being a very tough looking animal. I mean, we saw that with Chased by Dinosaurs, with that weird Tarbosaurus thing from Korea,
Yep.
the recent Jurassic World
Yep.
movie. So like it's out there, people know about it. And so of course to see a study like this where kind of the function of these claws is kind of left in the dark except as like a display feature,
Mm-hmm.
like you get a lot of folks who are like, "Oh, that's kind of bizarre or
Right.
weird," or you get the inevitable folks who are like, "Oh man, you're killing my childhood. That was
Yeah.
my dinosaur, and you just turned it into a wimpy thing." Um, but like, no, like I mean, obviously, like, I don't subscribe to that ideology, but I think it's interesting to see this result, um, because it kind of reminds me of a phenomena in evolution called runaway selection,
Mm-hmm.
where you have organisms where if a feature of the body is really conducive to attracting mates or winning contests for mates, then there's a possibility that as the generations go on, that feature will just increase in size
Right.
and sometimes vibrancy until you get a feature that just looks ridiculous
Yeah.
compared to its closest living relative. So, like the peacock's tail is a big example. Um, Megaloceros giganteus,
Mm.
the so-called Irish elk, that's the other one that you often hear. This deer with not in proportion to the body, but just in general, these enormous
Yeah.
antlers that look like giant spoons. And you look at it and you wonder, like, well, how can an animal live its life having to carry that around all the time? Well, it works out well for the animal, it seems. You know, if we go by the comparisons with living deer, that the
Mm.
antlers were mainly the display and for mating rituals. So to see something like Therizinosaurus, a seeming outlier among its group, because I mean, to my knowledge, I don't, there aren't any other like giant Therizinosaurs, are there?
No, it's by far the biggest one. Yeah.
Yeah, so like it kind of makes sense that for an animal so big, if the claws had a defensive, if the claws had a display feature and it works out, well then yeah, it's gonna make them really big and obnoxious looking. Um, Now, maybe it's weird because this goes into the whole, referencing nature today versus in the past with extrapolation that maybe it seems off because like of all the features of your body, why the claws?
Right. Yeah.
Why would you make the claws a display structure? We don't see that in nature, really, at least to my knowledge.
Mm.
But it's like, well, yeah, maybe not because all the possibilities of evolution probably aren't being explored today.
Right.
Maybe they were in the past, and so that's
Mm-hmm.
why you have something like claws as a display feature.
Right.
And of course, if you factor in like coloration and soft tissues, well, then who knows what these things look like. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
this animal has been portrayed as having just kind of standard dinosaur claws, like a gray black
Mm-hmm.
structure that's tough and horny. But like maybe it was brightly colored. Maybe the keratin over the bone itself, maybe it had all kinds of weird like grooves or structures coming off of that
Yeah.
that made it look even more wild than the fossils suggest.
Mm-hmm.
And those are things that unless we find them, we're just not going to know. So that it's intriguing to me to see this result.
Yeah.
It kind of goes to show that just because something is not known in nature doesn't mean that it's not possible.
Right.
And the fossil record just offers so many possibilities that most folks who are familiar with animal life today just probably wouldn't have thought of at first.
Yeah.
I think it's cool. I don't know. I think it's great. Um, and I'm waiting now for paleo artists to kind of take that and run with it. You know,
Mm.
I want to see I want to see a wild therizinosaur just putting those claws out there for a lady,
Yeah.
and just kind of go from there. So I'm down. I like this paper a lot. And of course, again, like just to reiterate, it's really cool to see just further evidence supporting this digging model for alvarezsaurs.
Mm.
It just fully fleshes out these animals for me more than they did before.
Yeah.
So yeah, unless there's anything else you want to add, we can move on to our final story.
Yeah, let's go ahead.
All right. So this next one here, um, so I wanted to present this today as part of a personal effort
Hmm.
that I wanted to set myself regarding the show. And that's kind of to showcase more news and info about classical societies
Hmm.
and then some, think of like ancient Iran or Greece or Rome. Because much of the coverage is well within the field of anthropology that I'm interested in, and I'm sure many of our viewers have a strong interest in those types of societies. So here we are. Now, this paper by Rosella Pava and colleagues concerns a curious burial on the island of Sardinia. So this is Tomb 27 at a site called Monte Luna in the Punic Roman necropolis of Santu Teru. Now, the phrase Punic Roman refers to the famed enemies of the ancient world. That is, Carthage, the former Phoenician colony on present day Tunisia turned empire, and the Roman Republic. Now, the word Punic is the Latin word for Phoenician, and it referred to the people of the western settlements in the Mediterranean. They had begun to settle in Sardinia around 1000 BC, frequently clashing with the Nuragic inhabitants who had lived there since Neolithic times, and eventually they subsumed much of the island into the Carthaginian Empire by 509 BC. Now, during the Punic Wars, which took place between 264 and 146 BC, the expansionist ideals of the Roman Republic came into conflict with those of Carthage, and so led to a series of land and sea battles for control of the Western Mediterranean. Carthage would lose out, and Sardinia became a Roman province in 238 BC after the first series of conflicts. So there was no like one Punic War; there were several of them, including the one that a lot of historians know about regarding Hannibal, the Carthaginian, who brought his war elephants over the Alps.
Hmm.
That's a fun story, and is being slowly backed by archaeology too, which is kind of fun. So this brings us to the site of Tomb 27, which has been dated to within the last few decades of the 3rd century BC. So well within the final battles for Sardinia between the Punics and the Romans, and the latter of which, of course, would then settle on the island from there. So this is a pit tomb. So it's located within a stony hill and then actually cut into the rock itself. The site actually consists of over 100 burials, previously used by the Carthaginians and later utilized by the Romans into the 2nd century BC. Tomb 27 itself contains a number of funerary artifacts, which have gone a long way towards the dating of the site, often having these big catalogs of artifacts from, say, Grecian or Roman times will help you date certain sites depending on what context they're used in. There are many characteristic Carthaginian items, cups and jars and pitchers. In particular, there's a type of vase called a Cintas 61 type, which went out of fashion at the end of the 3rd century. And there's a pottery cup of the Lamboglia 28F Morel 2648 form, these are flattering names, that is known at the end of the 3rd century and into the 2nd. So that kind of helps narrow the grave down a little bit. As well as the fact that there are coins in there, including a Roman coin, which also helps narrow it down to the earlier periods of Roman colonization. This will be important for later. Of interest here is a nearly complete skeleton in the tomb, determined by the team to have been a woman of between 18 and 22 years old. She's laid face down in the pit, arms to her sides. You can kind of see her here in the middle image. And her legs are straight out. Now, so far, nothing is unusual here. Simple burial, it seems. That is until we get to her skull. And the team found evidence of two types of trauma.
Hmm.
So, in the first instance, which we would call a type of blunt force trauma, the woman appears to have taken a serious fall in life, landing to the ground or on a hard object somewhere, and hitting the back of her head in such a way as to cause several lesions. And so the second instance appears to have been more intentional and occurred in the life and occurred after the woman had died, possibly from this fall, which would have been so serious. And you can see the image here on the right. This is the form of a roughly squarish shaped hole in the back of her skull, kind of right at the intersection of the occipital and parietal bones. Now, the shape and dimensions of the hole show a very remarkable similarity to Roman style iron nails, often used in construction, and have also been found in nearby contemporary archaeological sites in this part of Sardinia, although not in the grave itself, which is interesting. So, what does that mean? If this was the case, why would somebody pierce a dead woman's skull with a nail?
Hmm.
Seems kind of counterintuitive. She's
Right.
already dead. Um, well, the authors took all the information gathered at the site and they scoured the known classical literature, there's quite a bit of it, for clues. And they seem to have found a perfectly reasonable explanation
Hmm.
of what happened. So, first of all, we have to look to the writings of Pliny the Elder. This was a Roman military commander and administrator turned author. Now, while his time dates to a bit later than the time of the burial, so he was born in 23 AD and died on 79 AD during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, the famous one. He was there helping people, and he suffocated from the volcanic fumes. So that's been written about. Now, his writings often reflected the Roman view of the natural world going back centuries. So he's a big source for us, particularly when it comes to the natural world. And on this front, his 37-volume encyclopedia, Natural History, which we have a part of the cover here to the right, and a later uh, modern European edition, that contains much of his research and accounts of everything from minerals and their uses to animals and plants to surveys of geography, as well as descriptions and remedies of ancient illnesses. Now, back in antiquity, and until relatively recently in the grand scheme of history, there was a belief in miasma,
Hmm.
or bad air, which was a theory on how diseases and other illnesses spread from person to person. Now, one of these illnesses included epilepsy, or morbo sacro, the sacred disease, which was thought to be contagious. So the bodies of victims had to be purified to prevent its spread. And it just so happens that Pliny the Elder writes specifically of hammering a nail into a specific part of the dead person's body where epilepsy was thought to spread from. Now, considering the evidence of blunt force trauma on the woman's skeleton, we have now a plausible scenario where she fell during a seizure, an epileptic seizure, busted her skull, and later died, after which the back of her skull was struck with a nail to
Hmm.
prevent this so called illness from contaminating others. Of course, nowadays this is all kind of silly. I mean, it doesn't work from a medical standpoint. Epilepsy is in no way contagious, although it is serious. But at this time, before modern medicine, much less brain imaging techniques, this is how things went.
Hmm.
Um, Now, save for the curious instance of the nail not being preserved in the grave with the body, as is known in other sites of morbosacral rituals across the Mediterranean, the authors feel that this is the best explanation for the burial of this woman
Hmm.
in Tomb 27. And the fact that this is a Roman style remedy kind of hints at what the average everyday life of the people there was at the time following the Punic Wars as they settled in Sardinia and brought their culture with them. But there are other scenarios that the authors state that they at least could be investigated if this turns out not to be the case. Of course, there's no evidence that directly says this woman, here lies a woman with epilepsy, and we nailed her in the head, so she's good.
Hmm.
We're not gonna catch it. Um, uh, for example, nailing sharp objects into a part of the body was a way to relieve pressure back in the day. And whatever blunt force trauma the woman sustained may have been treated in this way.
Hmm.
So maybe after she hit her head following the seizure, there was so much pain that, oh, I'm in pain, and you take a nail and it just kind of channels out the feeling. Who knows? But if it is the case that we have a victim here of an epileptic seizure and her eventual purification by a nail to the skull, as gruesome as that sounds, then this burial offers a really great window into the medical world of the ancient past. And I just want to say that I think it's really interesting that you were talking about your study just recently, Albert. That your blog post inspired in part this the alvarezsaur and therizinosaur paper.
Mm.
This study was inspired by the researchers looking at a photograph
Huh.
of this burial, and they saw it and they were so curious about it that they decided to go investigate further. So it's kind of interesting to see how different factors can go into inspiring big studies like
Mm-hmm.
these.
Yeah.
It's really neat. I thought this was a pretty cool paper. It was talked about in the archaeology magazine, so I wanted to highlight it here.
Mm.
Um, Albert, do you have anything you wanted to add about it?
Uh, yeah, I suppose I feel like the study certainly highlights the importance of like you know keeping records of writing and such because it was like ancient writings that helped kind of solve this mystery or at least get to the most plausible possible explanation. And obviously, things people write are not always reliable. We know that very well, but they definitely can add very valuable lines of evidence to when it comes to interpreting things like this. And yeah, that is really interesting too about how the photograph inspired the study. Yeah, inspiration in scientific research can come from all kinds of places. That definitely so something that impressed on me, and then something I think is still true is that creativity kind of matters a lot in doing scientific research. It's not just a bunch of like robots calculating things. Like yeah, it's like reading about things or and looking at things and can often provide the first impetus into like conducting a scientific study. Um, and this is kind of reverse of how they did the study because they found the signs of trauma and then went to ancient writings to kind of decipher what might have happened. But reading about this study did remind me of kind of the how interesting it can be to find direct evidence of something that you've only read about or know from kind of secondary sources. Because yeah, it's like it's one thing to know that people of this time thought that diseases were caused in this way and that certain diseases could be cured in this way, but it's another thing entirely to actually find direct evidence of this occurring. And I think that's always a pretty special feeling to me personally, like where you read about something and you go out and look at nature and you actually find actually witness the thing happening or see something in the flesh. That happens to me all the time when I watch birds, for example, like seeing behaviors that I've only read about or seeing new species that I had not seen before but only known from books or documentaries. It's always wonderful. I think there's definitely yeah, that definitely inspires a sense of wonder to be able to see the things in reality. And so yeah, it's really cool to see that kind of feedback loop where looking at the real things versus looking at other people's records of those things, and both those things I think can be very personally significant and very important to doing scientific research. So I think I kind of maybe a stretch when it comes to the connection, but those are some of the main thoughts that came to my mind.
No, I agree completely. I think that's absolutely fair. Like especially with something like classical archaeology, where
Yeah.
you're looking at evidence of sites that we have so much copious information about already because the writings of the people at the time have survived up until this point.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's an interesting area here because traditionally in pre-archaeological times, or at least in pre-modern archaeological times, if you were a historian writing about ancient Rome, um, that was your source. You went to the literature, or at the very least, like if there was a site in Rome somewhere that was still standing despite the echoes of time and the movements of culture. You could go and look at that, but that was all you used. Now with archaeology, we can not only supplement these texts, but we can also kind of verify or reject things that have been written in the past as being inaccurate or like poorly accounted for or even like deliberately manipulated. Um, and we see examples of this all across
Hmm.
different parts of certainly Eurasia and Africa. Goodness knows, biblical archaeologists have an interesting relationship with their texts versus the actual archaeological finds themselves. Of course, we could do a whole episode series about that. But when it comes to something like ancient Rome, where the literature and research on it is so vast, you can even like it's amazing that you can still have these surprises to begin with.
Yeah. Mm.
I mean, just the other day, some Roman coinage was found that confirmed that this uh, there was a Roman individual who was thought to have been kind of a mythical figure, but he turned out to be actually like a lost Roman emperor
Huh. Huh.
that that nobody had known about, or at the very least had heard about, or were skeptical. Like they thought that he was kind of like a fictional entity, but like nope, we have pretty strong evidence that he reigned for at least a little while. And so now these Roman emperor lists that have been copied and passed down for centuries, now we got a new name to put on them, and it's just cool. It's fascinating,
Yeah.
and there's always something new to learn, even in the subject where you would think you have everything that you need. There's always something there. Um, so yeah, I think definitely that we picked some really great stories today, and that's about the end of our series for now. We definitely want to thank you all for coming in and listening to our stories and what we had to say.
Yeah. Mm.
So now we'll go on to our general acknowledgments.
Mm.
So we are on Patreon, of course, patreon.com/time and clades. If you're interested in donating at least even a little bit, your help will be very appreciated and will help us continue this series and develop new projects and expansions. Our current patrons right now include Paul, Denver, and Frankish, as well as a brand new patron, Val Denunzio, and I apologize if I mispronounced that. We want to thank you all so much for your support and your helpful comments. It's always nice to see. Of course, the music for our series is provided by our good friend Henry, and the color scheme for Albert's alvarezsaur avatar was by Alicia Hutchinson, and so we want to thank them all for their help. And of course, we are on Twitter. So if you're interested in kind of following us, we are at Time and Clades. But most likely you're going to watch us on our YouTube page through Time and Clades. So if you want to like and subscribe, we appreciate that. If you have any questions about the show regarding the subjects that we've talked about today or just anything in general, you can send us an email, timeandclades@gmail.com, or you can leave us a comment on our YouTube section, or even leave us a tweet. And we will certainly get it and respond if necessary. And of course, if you want to read about any of the papers that we've talked about today, we have the links in the description for the references that we've talked about. And with that, that is the end here. Albert, is there anything else you want to add, or are we good to go?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. As for what we have coming up next, well, we will definitely aim to do a March news episode in April eventually. Um, but yeah, we've been discussing some other things, but I think we'll hold off on doing an official announcement until they're confirmed. So yeah, in the meantime, take care, everybody, and we hope to see you real soon.
Yes, thanks so much.